How's it going? Happy New Year. All right, that testing. That's better, I think. All right, does this sound? Oh, that's too much. How about this? Getting closer. Is this a good amount of audio? And can you hear me? All right, we're gonna start in a few minutes here. I'm just gonna make sure Victoria. We got this new mic. I really don't like this. This is weird to me. I don't feel comfortable with this. I know, like spin class or something like that. Did anybody see Kimmy Schmidt, the Netflix Tristafe? Is like that's what I feel like now. Yeah. Okay, thanks, Gabe. And how about the audio levels? Is this good, or should I turn it down a little bit? It's probably going to be speaking a little bit louder than this. Yeah, okay, thanks, Gabe. All right, we can get started. We got a new mic now. I hope this is better. They can control the volume. That's good. I just don't want it to clip. That's the main thing for me. So I'm watching these red levels here, because even if you can change the volume, I'll play it a little bit safer, making sure I don't get into that red, because then we just lose the audio completely. All right. But yeah, I can move it away. Is that better? How's that? Okay, I'm going to keep talking as if I were in front of a group of people. Okay, good. Thank you, Sammy. All right, thanks for being patient. Obviously, new mic. Hopefully this works better. It feels really weird this thing on. This one's a little less obtrusive, I think, right? Okay, so we're already a bit behind on schedule. No matter. We got about an hour to cover this stuff. My goal today, this afternoon, I'm going to show you some code. We're going to write an application. It's going to make some requests, but again, we're not expected to 100% understand absolutely everything that's going on, but I want us to ask questions. But the idea isn't you don't come out of this knowing exactly how to, or being able to write this from scratch. That's not really my goal here, but I do want to show you what's possible and kind of how we can use this request library, how we can integrate that with Node. But the most important thing that I want to talk about today, and this new topic for today or this afternoon, is the environment. When I run my Node application, there is a concept of an environment. They call it the Node environment. And when we're talking about environments, we might care about things like whether or not we're in a production environment or a development environment or a test environment. We want to have a variable that describes this. We might want to store some information about a server that we don't want to include in our code, so we might store that in the environment. The environment holds variables for us, and we can actually run the exact same application, and based on the environment that it's in with different variables, the application could run differently. So we've got our application code and we've got our environment variables, and to these together create an application. Cool? We want to separate our code and our configuration. If I am going to have something that could change based on the environment that my code is running in, I want to make sure that that does not get included in the code, but is instead included in the config. There's this idea. It's called the 12-factor app. And there's a lot of reading to it. But if you want to build web apps, you might want to follow some of these guidelines. So I'll let you look up and read this on your own, but I will point that config is number 3. And so this is where I'm getting some of this from, and why sort of part of why I'm mentioning this here. When we talk about config, we want to store the configuration of our application in the environment, right? Because every machine might have a different environment, but they run the same code. So the differences might come from that environment configuration. You can look into some of the details of this, but I'm going to show you some examples of things that might make sense. So on Amazon, we might want to use S3. This is a way for us to store files on Amazon. Now, if I'm running the app in one environment, I might want it to use one AWS store. They'll call them stores. In another environment, I want to use a different one. So what I'll do is in my code, I'll actually have a variable. Variable says, what is my AWS server location? My code doesn't know what it is, but in my configuration, I'll set this variable, and then when the app loads, it reads it from my environment, and then it uses the version of AWS that I want it to, or the AWS server that I want it to. The same is true for a database. I might have a different database running on my local machine than I do when I have it in production. So in that case, I might want to tell it to use a different database based on the environment that it's in. In terms of, yeah, so I mean, those are some examples. Really what we're talking about today, though, is how do we store secrets? Who wants to store their secrets on GitHub? It's a dangerous thing. So this is really why we're learning about this today, is because we want to help you avoid giving up the credentials that you have, right? These secret keys and tokens and all of that. So for today, we're going to be worrying about storing this in our environment. When I run the application, the code does not know about my keys, tokens, or passwords, but the environment configuration does. I'll show you where mine's stored. In this application, I have an environment file here called .env, and I'm going to just store the names of my variables in there, and I could have my own settings for this. You might have your own version of this file with different values in here. That's how we separate the code and the configuration. So if we can store keys, tokens, and passwords, it might look like this. We're going to use a tool called .env. This is a library. We just npm install it. And then once we have .env, we have the ability to create this environment file. You store this at the root of your project beside the package.json. That's where it's going to look for it. And then you start to add your environment variables in there, okay? So here, the environment variable we want to add is GitHub API token. And then I'm going to set that to my token value. This is something you're going to have to do because you are going to need to interact with the GitHub API. And in order to do that, you'll probably want a token. So this is an example of that. Whatever value you get from GitHub, when I create my new token, demo, you're going to be doing this as well, right? So we create the demo token. Here it is. Here's my token. I copy and paste this into my .env file. Now that's the value that exists for that token. And when my code looks for it, it's going to use the thing that I gave it, the value that I gave it. Let's look a little bit more, actually, before we do this. Then I require that tool into my software, and I call the config method on it. And what that does is it reads this .env file, and then it parses it line by line, and it takes those key value pairs, and it puts them into my application under process.env. So within Node, if I add variables to my environment, I can access them using process.env. I'm going to show you an example of this. And then I just have to give it the same name that or use the same name that I gave it in my environment file. So this sounds pretty complicated, right? Like this fact that we're doing this. It's a really good way for us to share configurations, for us to share code and have people, multiple people work on the same project. An easier way to manage the environment might be if you go into your command line here. I'm going to bring this up in size. If you go into your command line and you type export, your values will exist different than mine because your environment is different than mine. Try it. Try typing in export. You're going to see that it's going to print out a whole bunch of different key and value pairs. These are your environment variables. These are the variables that exist in my environment right now. We can see, I mean, these are all pretty built in. You've got path here. That's pretty common. If I want to add a variable to this, I can call export, give it the name of the variable that I want, and then equals the key, the value that I want. And now when I type in just export again to list them all out, where is it? Oh, did I type it wrong? Is it set myvar? Okay, maybe a mistake here. Let's go back to the notes quickly. Okay, no, I did export key equals value. Why is that not showing up? Oh, there it is. Sorry, I just probably didn't go high enough. So here's my var equals my value. I was able to set this. And as long as I keep this terminal session open, that variable is set for this session. If I exit, or let's say create a new session, that's probably easier, and export, we're going to notice that my var is there no longer. So that was a temporary thing that I did just for that session, right? This is one of the reasons I want to use this .env file, is because then I can just store those in the file, and I don't care how many sessions I open, how many times I restart the virtual machine. Any of that stuff doesn't matter at that point. The variables will get set from the file that I created. And so this is a way to do that, right? If you want to temporarily set variables, do it this way. But remember, if you restart this session, that variable will be lost, right? Yes?
When you say session, like, are you running Node right now?
So I'm thinking about a terminal session. When I say session, I mean terminal session. When I start up a new terminal like this, I've just started a new session, a new terminal session. And so every terminal session will have an environment. And the environment will be, by default, when I start up, there is a default environment. If I type in export, I'm definitely going to get stuff. But then I can also manipulate that environment by typing export and then my var equals my value, that's going to now set a value. But if I start a new session, that value doesn't exist in that session. There are ways for me to make sure that values exist across sessions. I can modify something called, yours is probably going to be I think a bash profile. If I edit this file, I should be able to type commands like export my var equals my value. And now every time I start a new session, this file gets run, and I know that because that's part of the bash software. So then it would export that every time I create a new session. That's how one way I could get variables in more permanently. But I don't want variables to exist in my environment across the board. I want it to be project-based. Again, another reason why I just put it in that environment file, and then it's tied to that project, and it's only used for when that project's running. And so it means that my environment does not get littered with a whole bunch of variables that I don't need. And then there's no conflict or overwrite problems, right? So another way to do this is anytime I run node, if I run node here, I can say console.log process.env. Here are all of those variables provided to node now. Right? When node runs, it takes all of those variables in my environment and it puts them into an object called process.env. Process.env. Now process.env has each of these values available to me. So this is how I access it when I'm actually in the node environment. So then I'm going to show you one more quick way to be able to temporarily, kill that, to be able to temporarily set a variable for the lifetime of a node application. That might be something we want to do. My var equals, actually, what I should do is definitely create a new session first. We're going to verify that my var is not in here, right? So this is not in my default session environment right now. If I want to set the variable just for the execution of this software, I would do it like this. Before I run the application, I can set this variable. I run the application. Now inside of here, if I console log process env, oops, where is it? It should be here. Ah, there it is, down at the end. So I was able to set that just for the life cycle of the program. So there's three ways, let's say, to set environment variables, right? One of them, just do it before you run the application. And then if you wanted to run a script, that's how I would do it. So now inside index.js, I would have access to process.env.myvar, even if it didn't exist in my exported variables. Okay. The next way I could do it is set it just for the session. And so now if I executed this, it would be part of the session. It'd be a variable that I have for the session. And as long as I didn't restart the session, I would have access to this in the same way. Process.env.myvar. Now the third way, and the way that I want people to do this, is through this .env file. And that's where we've left off here. So can we kind of see why this file might be useful? It does two things for us. It allows us to define variables, environment variables that we want. And it allows us to specify them just for this application. The other ways they didn't care about node or anything like that. They just cared about the environment we're in. So this is a very node specific way to do it, but it's quite useful for that. Okay. So here's a rule: don't commit your .env file. If the whole point of this is to get these secrets out of our code, then we can't just turn around and commit our .env file, because then that goes into GitHub and now people have access to our secrets again, right? So the way that we deal with this is I will commit a file called .env.example to my project. And the whole purpose of this file is just to show you what environment variables you need to set yourself to make this application work, right? Because then what you do is you take this .env.example file, you remove the .example, and then you fill in your values for it, which I don't know the answer to that, like what those values are. You have to find them yourself, right? So this is what I would commit, whereas you never want to commit .env. And the way that we deal with this, is through our .gitignore file, right? So in my .gitignore, I've got this .env file, so it will not be tracked by version control. Everyone, though, when you look at their directory, should have their own .env file, but you got to create it when you clone the first time. Does that kind of make sense? Okay. All right. All right. So we got time for questions as we go through this. What I want to do is show you a little bit about how we can use this this thing right here, this env file, and how we can use it with GitHub. Or how we make requests to GitHub, get information back. This is what your GitHub avatar downloader is all about. So I'm not going to go too far into it. I'm just going to show you a couple of things that you might get caught up with, okay? But the most of today and the rest of the half hour I'd like to spend is actually on this other little application here, which doesn't use GitHub at all, but it actually calls two different APIs, one to find your location, and then two to get weather for that location. So that's what we'll actually work towards, but first we're going to just get a little bit of this out of the way. So I don't know if I even need to rewrite this. First thing we've done, got this first line. What is this doing for us at a high level? Yeah. So so I could have written this as var.env equals, and then I go to the next line and I say .env.config, right? I've basically done the same thing in 2 lines rather than 1 line now. Make sense? Yeah? Yeah, everyone good? So I'm just calling config directly on the thing that I got back from .env, and I don't need to store it as a variable because I'm not using it anywhere else. That's why I can do this 1 line here, right? That's why I don't need to var equals. I don't need to use it anywhere. That's why I'm leaving it out. Okay. Although I am using it, I'm using it directly here and only that 1 time. That's why, but that's why you don't see me assigning this to a variable. Yeah. Of course. Yes. Yeah. So the first thing here, .env equals. So the first thing we're doing is just importing this module, and they provided to us. It looks like an object that has a function called config on it. I think that's what it is, like .env. Based on what I've looked at, like it's hard to know for sure. The best way to know, though, is you go and you look at their actual code. That's .env Ruby. We don't want that. .env JS. Here's GitHub. Okay. So, I mean, one way we can do this is we can look at the code for it. And it looks like it's... So here's where it's actually, what it's exporting. This is what our module exports. It exports 3 different functions, one called config, one called load, and one called parse. I've actually never used the parse one before. Maybe you can do your own parsing on that file and then do something different with it if you wanted to. But what I want to focus on is these 2 things. This is our API into the .env module. The API gives us 2 functions. Interestingly enough, what are we noticing that's interesting about these exports? Yeah, it's actually load happens to be an alias for config. So you could use load or config interchangeably. It's up to you. I would choose one and just live with it, right, and kind of go with it. Why is there both? I wasn't there when they made the decision, so I don't have the real answer. Why? But yeah, that's the kind of question I can answer, right? The situations where I've seen this in the past could be for backwards compatibility. It could be that load used to do something and it doesn't do something different anymore, and now they've decided just to make it do the same thing. Yeah, I mean, sometimes they come up with a better name for something, but don't want to break backwards compatibility. So everyone who's used config up until version 2, they can still continue to use config. They release version 3. Load is a new option. People could switch it or not. It's up to them. That's why you might see stuff like that. Yeah, I think load is actually better. To me, this is way more descriptive of what this library is doing. It's loading the environment variables for me, and so I prefer the load call. Exactly, and so that might be why you see that. So we see here, this is what we're importing. What we're importing happens to be an object that has, oops, I kind of lost it. There it is. It happens to have an object on it that exports, well, an object with 3 functions: config, load, and parse. So if config and load, I can just call them directly on that, and I've done everything .env needs to do, which is find my .env file, load it, parse it, and then inject those variables into the process.env object. Okay, sounds like a lot. They do it all for you. We don't have to write that code. Next thing I'm going to do is import a require library. Instead of HTTP, I'm going to import require. Sorry? Is it? Sorry, request. Yeah, I'm going to require request. So I'm going to import request. And request provides a nicer API to making HTTP requests. I think that the built-in Node HTTP library is not very user-friendly, but request is. I think it's also better documented. It's a good reason to use it. We're going to notice some differences, though. One of the core differences is that when we make a request, we can still give it an options object. Now, don't read the node options when you want to find out what the options are for the request library. We should actually be looking at the request library documentation, maybe for JS. So I come in here. I want to make sure that, yeah, I'm looking at these documentation here. I think there's a config object in here. Wow, awesome. Let's try just request. Request function. There we go. Definitely takes a string. What else? There we go. All I had to do was kind of scroll down. I'll go to the top again. So it's nice if you kind of spend some time reading at the beginning here. It says, here's a very simple example. Here's your table of contents. Here's all the available options. That's where my configuration documentation is going to exist. And so request takes in 2 parameters. It's not actually telling me that callback is optional. I like that. So options and callback. I've got those 2 here. I've got my options object, and I've got my callback function. Does that make sense? So that's the API. Some of these options, including the URL, that's the location protocol. It's also the path that I'm going to use. The path is /users/Jensen/repos. If I were to look at the GitHub API documentation, I can find that under where's a good place? Let's see. Here we go, repositories. And then under repositories, I have a whole bunch of different options. I want to list my repositories. This would just be get/user/repos, and that's going to assume that it knows who I am, and it's going to get my repos. If I want to, I can also specify another user's username and get their repos, right? So in order to use this API, it needs to know who I am. Whereas in order to use this one, it doesn't necessarily need to know who I am because I'm telling it who I want the repo for. Does that make sense? Okay, so this is what I'm going to use. And that just matches exactly what I have right here, where my username happens to be Jensen. So that's the one we're going to put in there as a parameter. When they put this colon in here, usually that means it's a variable. It's something they want you to put a value into rather than just, I would never use that exactly, because then it would think that my username was :username. That's not what it is, right? So here, that's my username, Jensen. I make the request. I'm going to tell it, so QS stands for query string. I can attach parameters to a URL after a question mark. Is anyone not familiar with this? So this is called a query string. Again, more key value pairs. If I have a URL with a path, I can put a question mark at the end of it, and everything after that becomes the query string. I want it to be sorted based on when it was created. And I want the access token to be equal to, and then I take that value, put it in here. Something like that, right? But the request library gives me a bit of a nicer way to do these query strings. So all of that data could just exist on the QS object instead. And so I'd put my query strings here, including the sort and the access token. You'll notice I'm not actually putting the token here. We've talked about that, right? That's going to come from my environment file. So whatever I put in here as the token, that's going to be the token it uses. I might as well grab it now, right? I created the token, I copy it, I paste it into my .env file, and so now when I run this application, it will load that file, it will add that to the environment for me, and now I have access to my GitHub token value, right? Okay. Another thing we want to add here, some headers. If I do not add the headers, GitHub will complain. We'll see what that looks like. And then afterwards, after I made the request, this is the code that's going to get called. It's this function. And the major difference here is I don't have to do this whole chunk download myself. The request library is doing that for me. It's taking care of it. It's abstracting that logic from me. I don't care about that. All I care about is, one, you're going to give me information about the response. Two, you're going to give me the body of the response. So we get both of those pieces as well. Now we get the response and the body in this callback. Slight difference from the HTTP library, right? We still do the same thing with the body once we received it. We convert it from a string into an actual array of objects or an object or whatever. And we get the repos from that. So if I were to run this, I could curl lots and lots of repos for this user. One of the repos name is web server notes. Happens to be tomorrow's lecture notes, right? So this is giving me back a list of all the repos that this user has as a JSON object. So I can, by looking at this data, and actually if I go into my browser, oops, I should probably copy and paste that again. If I go into my browser and make this request, no. That's better. Then we can use these nice debugging tools here to actually see the structure of these objects. I can go in here, see the preview. So it's an array of objects, and each object has all of this data available to me. The name of this repo, somewhere down here, Ajax notes. Right? Okay. So this gives me back an array of objects. That means I need to parse it. Repos is now an array of repo objects. For each repo, I want to go through and print out the repo's name. Once I've gone through every repo and printed that name out, I'm just going to print out the number of repos that exist for that user. And there it is, right? So here's all the names. Here's the number of repos. And this is the code that executed that, right? Let's see what happens if I remove this header. Ah, I didn't like that very much. I don't have any error handling in my code. Might get a bit more information if I do it this way. Let's see. Oh, actually, I got the information either way. Request forbidden by administrative rules. Please make sure your request has a user agent header. So this is GitHub coming back to me and saying, you can't make a request without a user agent. We do not allow it. So you're going to get this. You're going to get this back until you put a user agent in there. And so that's why I have my header user agent set. And you'll know I put node application. Like it doesn't matter what I put here. I've tested it. GitHub doesn't care what I put in there, just that it exists or not. Yes.
Why?
Why do they care?
Yeah. Especially you can put anything you want in there. What's the point?
Yeah, it's a good question. Maybe they have some rationale on their documentation. Let's see. Check this for user agent required. Why do they like it? Okay, well, so here they're saying we request that you use your GitHub username or name of your application for the user agent header value. This allows us to contact you if there are problems. That actually makes sense to me. Now, if I use whatever I want, we lose this, right? But if I'm good and I put my information in there, then we don't lose that benefit. And there's not really a way for them to really enforce that. So that's probably why they let us put anything in there. They're just hoping that we do the right thing. So they're saying you have to put something, so you may as well put something good in there.
Right.
And yeah, so I wouldn't actually put this. I would put something that identified my application. most likely. Yeah. But will accept anything. Okay. The other quick thing I want to note is that when I make my curl request here, actually, I'm gonna run out of time if I do that. If people notice, if I do not put the access token, the difference between having an access token and not having an access token, usually it's actually the difference between accessing the API and not accessing the API. For example, if you don't have a token, they just won't let you have any information. Whereas with GitHub, what they're saying is, you don't have to have a token, but if you don't have a token, we're going to limit your request to 50 per hour for your IP address. But if you do have a token, we'll give you 5,000. Just kind of helps with development, right? The other thing is, how many people are in this room? 20 or so? That would be doing this assignment today? How many IPs do we have in this room? Pretty much one we're sharing, right? So the idea is if everyone did a request twice to GitHub, we'd have to wait maybe 40 minutes, 30 minutes, whatever, until we could do another. That's bad for development. So let's just put a token in there, get 5,000 requests each, and not worry about it anymore after that. Okay? I won't go into details on this because we'll learn everything that is sort of everything that's in here. We kind of get access to that through here. It's more complicated, but it's also I think a bit more interesting of an exercise. Good there. Okay. So like I said, I'm going to be doing some things in here that might not be super clear to you. All the notes are going to be there. There'll be a little bit of extra explanation in the notes. I'm going to be doing things with dates that I won't have time to fully explain. So you'll just have to trust me that when I call date format and provided some sort of a string like this, I'm telling it the way that I want it to format the date. But if you want to go look at the documentation for a moment, it's all out there. We can all read that. I just won't have the time today. So let's start by running this application, just seeing what the expected output is. So it is node index.js. Ooh, okay. So I've got my first error. It's saying location undefined, undefined. I'm trying to run this application, and I think I know what's happening. It's that I don't have my key set up for this API that I'm trying to use. Now I could where's on retrieve weather? There it is. I could maybe console log the error here. Let's do that. Yeah, it's saying null. Okay, so it doesn't really, it's not really giving me access to that information. So what I want to do then is I'm going to just try to set this value and see if that fixes the problem for me. Okay. So dark sky secret key, that's the name of the variable. I've already got one in here because I got this from env.example, let's say. So now what I need to do is go sign up for my dark sky API account and then ask them for my own token and then put that in here. You don't have to watch me do the whole thing because I've already done all that work of signing up, and all I need to do now is reset my token to give me one that's fresh here. So here's a fresh token I'm about to apply for dark sky. Put it here, save it. And let's see if our app runs a little bit different now. It's not. We're still getting undefined, undefined. So why is that? Where's location? There it is.
Are you sure it's the same URL that's
Oh, my bad.
the rest of the message was different?
No, you're right. And actually, the first request that's made is actually to IP stack. So let me tell you a bit about these. I had them in the wrong order here, but I actually have to think about them in the right order. IP stack is the service I'm going to use to figure out where I am located. And then once I know where I'm located, then I can figure out what the weather is at that location. So I made the mistake of setting the dark sky API before setting the IP stack API. And the one that I need first is the IP stack because I'm going to first make a request to IP stack here, and they're going to give me back data that looks like this, including a latitude and a longitude for that IP address. This is geolocation for IP addresses. So this is a third-party service that if I if I make the request to do a lookup, I can say I want to know the location of this IP address here, and I'm going to give you the secret key that I use for that. So I'll go back into my login, grab this secret key, make sure I have both of these tokens or the keys in my environment. Now I have, for both the APIs that I want to use, I have the tokens available. So now we should actually get, that's better. These ones do not expire specifically. They might tell you if they expire. It's not a bad practice to rotate them, to actually even use an API to request a new token every now and then. That's not something we need to even really worry about today, but yeah, in the future, that's right. And also, I'm giving you all access to my tokens right now, so you could easily go and use IP stack, and eventually, if you made enough requests, they'd start charging me for it. So one of the things I want to do is after this is done, I'm gonna reset this. It will invalidate the old one, give me a new one that you won't have seen, and then now I'm protected again, right? But for the next 20-30 minutes until I reset this, I get 10,000 for free, so I'm probably okay for now. Yeah. Well, if you can do that, then I'll pay for it, because that means you've learned a lot from today. And that's useful. Okay, so we can see it's working now. I run it. It runs this. It first prints out this powered by dark sky, and then it prints out the location, Vancouver, BC. And then for each day for the next week, it gives me information. It gives me the date, the low and high temperature, and I got this little emoji that shows if it's going to rain or be sunny or some other sort of representation of the weather, right? Okay, so let's start with, like, why do I have this powered by dark sky? That's very simple. It's just a function that logs that out. And the very first thing that my program does after declaring all of its variables and functions is call that function to print it out, the legal stuff. The reason I've done that is if I look at their documentation, I want to read this. I want to know what the rules of engagement are for me to use this API. So they're saying you can have 1,000 API requests free of charge. Good. That's fine. It's easy for me to test. But every API request after that costs 0.000, thousandth of a cent or whatever. But this is important. You are required to display the message powered by dark sky that links to darksky.net/poweredby somewhere in your app. If attribution isn't for you, then email sales and ask them about white labeling, which basically means I'm probably paying them more for the right to use their service without advertising for them at the same time. Does that kind of make sense? Okay. So to get by these terms of service, I felt like the best way to satisfy that requirement in a console application, because I don't have links, is just to print out both of those pieces of information, right? I'm just showing you that sometimes when we use API, we do have to kind of play by their rules and know what the licensing guidelines are. So now that that's out of the way, I print out the location. The location comes from my first API request. I make a request to IP stack, and I get back the location, data.city, data.region code. That's going to match what they tell me is available in here under the docs. So data.city, yep, I'm using that, and data.region code CA, right? We can see why they didn't put postal code or province there or state, because they sort of planned for that, right? They said we're not just in the state, we're not just a US company, we're not just a Canadian company, we're not just a European company. A region is a way for us to signify provinces, states, cantons in Switzerland or whatever, right? They got all these different things that you need. So that's why I've used region code there, but for me it means province today, right? At least in this case. So I make the request, I get this information back, and then this is the dependency that I have though. In order for me to get the weather for a location, I have to have that location information. So I cannot make the request to the weather API before I get the latitude and longitude back, right? And that's what's happening here. I make the request to get the location using the IP stack API. I get the response back and the body of that response, which is JSON. I parse that JSON, convert it into something that I can work with. Data has a city and a region code, so I can just print that out. And then I'm going to take the data latitude and data longitude and pass that to my other function called retrieve weather. Retrieve weather takes that in, and now when it calls the dark sky API, not only do I provide the secret key, but also the latitude and longitude that I'm interested in the weather for. Right? Okay. Start from this point. Yes.
Questions about the dollar signs. Is that jQuery or is that something that's within this?
Are there dollar signs in here? Oh, this stuff. Okay. Yeah, so my mistake. I didn't think fully about the fact that this is something we learn tomorrow afternoon. It's template literals, so it's another way to define strings. And instead of me having to say, because the alternative, what you would do today with the knowledge you have is date plus tab plus weather.low plus weather.high. I have to put a lot of thought into how this works because it's kind of a... I don't do it much anymore. I use the template literals now. But these two things should give me the same result. Both would console log a string that had the date, 2 tabs, the low weather with a decimal or kind of a degree symbol, etc. But the difference here is that I'm able to, by using these backticks, just embed context in there from variables. So instead of having to do this concatenation of strings, I'm able to create one string, but signify that there are variables inside of that string. And so anything that happens inside of here, that is going to be interpreted as JavaScript and executed as JavaScript, and whatever the result of that is will be written into the string for me. Again, we'll go into more detail tomorrow afternoon in the ES6 lecture. But yeah, that's one part that I slipped up. You'll see I used functions here instead of arrow functions.
Oh, yeah.
I didn't fully commit to that. So I think this is a relatively straightforward concept. The idea here is that data is a variable, and we want it to end up being in that string later on, in that formatted in this way. And this is the formatting for this whole thing right here. Date, tab, yeah, low, degree, space, 2, yeah, etc. Okay, it's a good question though. And likely, if I were to write this again, I could just do it the other way. The other thing here is I'm going to leave this lookup table that I have for weather. I actually created this because I wanted to have text that could be represented by emojis. And so if I look at the dark sky API here, they have this concept of an icon. And this icon says rain. So they've decided that they have a whole bunch of different icons that they want to that represent the weather for that point in time. And I want to convert that into an emoji. And so I've created a table that matches the possible values to the emoji that I thought best represented that value. We could look at icon. I don't know if they list out here. So in the documentation, they've provided to us a list of all the possible values: clear day, clear night, rain, snow, sleet, etc. Right? So I've taken these values and I've converted them, and I've just made a lookup table that allows me to convert from a clear day into this sun emoji, or from wind into these kind of blowing leaves emoji, right? And if I wanted to, I could always say weather clear day, and that gives me back a sun emoji, right? Okay. So I'm going to be able to grab this data from the API, put that in there, and what it does is I do the lookup, and it gives me back the emoji that represents that thing instead. That's what this table's there for. We'll use it a little bit more, okay? So let me get the code up here just to make sure, because I want to copy and paste some of these things in. Okay. So the first thing I want to do is make the request to the IP stack API. You know what I'm going to do is I'm going to just copy and paste this to save a little bit of time. But I'm going to actually put the function in here. Okay. So this is going to be my first request. I'm passing an object that represents the options for this request, the URL, and the query string. If I look back at the documentation for this, they're saying append your API access key. This is how we do it, as a query string. So they've instructed me to do this. I could just tack this on to the end of the URL and not have a QS section of my options. Like I could do it this way instead. And then if I'm using a template literal, I can get away with that. I don't know, I'm using the request library, so to me it makes a little bit more sense to be explicit about my query strings in the object they provided to me, but that's all that's doing there, is it's providing the access token or access key as a query string on here. You'll also notice that there's 3 different ways for me to call this function, or this API. 3 available endpoints. Standard lookup. Look up the data behind an IP address. In that case, I have to provide the IP address. Do I know what my IP address is? I could figure it out, right? I don't really want to do that. I could do bulk lookup. That actually means if I want to look up multiple addresses at the same time, I could see that being useful for something else completely, but also very useful. In that case, you're going to do a comma-separated list of IP addresses. Okay? But there's a third option, and this is the one I actually want to go with. The third option is actually the requester lookup. And with the requester lookup, what it's going to do is I pass it the path I'm making the request to is /check, and that tells it that it should look up what my IP address is. Because I made the request, it knows who I am, so it can figure out what my IP address is, and then based on that, it's going to send me the location for the address of the requester. That means that if I give this app to someone else and they run it in Toronto on some other IP address, then their location will be there taken care of, right? So I didn't provide an IP address. I said check. I just want it to be the requester lookup. Here's the data that I just got back from making that request. And I know it's hard to read. Here's a quick tip. If you have an editor that has extension support, install something like JSON Prettify or JSON Beautify or something like that. I paste in this ugly JSON. I run my Prettify command, and now I've got nice JSON, right? So this is my tool is helping me with. I'm not going to go into the details of how to do it with VS Code because it really is just an extension called like Beautify or Prettify JSON. So you look it up for your editor. We don't all use the same editor, so it might be different for you. But most Atom, Sublime Text, VS Code should all have the ability to do this for you. And so now when I look through here, I get to see the exact data that is sent back to me for that request. And it's telling me that this is my IP address, that this is where I'm located, here's the city, and the most important information is the latitude and longitude, which looks correct to me. It's on that 49th parallel. Makes sense, right? Okay. So if that's the case, then I can take this understanding and bring it in here and say, well, first I just need to make it something I can work with, an object that I can work with. And now I want to console.log data I just want to make sure that this is how I'm accessing it. So I'll run this again. Oops. And there it is. It gave me back the latitude and longitude that I could then use in my next API request, right? I was also actually curious about a few other things, so let's just get that out of the way. Console log location plus data.city plus put a comma and a space in there. Something like that, maybe. Oh, localtion. That's fine. I'll fix that. But that's working now, right? Location, Vancouver, BC. I'm able to gather information. Location. There we go. Okay. Now, this is where we could start to get into trouble, right? Because if I decide I'm just going to do another request, now I'm getting into nested like callback within a callback within a callback. This starts to be hard to see what's going on. Do we just continue with this, or do we put this into a function? Sorry? Anyone? Function? Yeah, let's do it. Why not? I don't want this to be confusing. That's my number one goal. So maybe now what I would do is I would say get weather for the lat and longitude for data dot latitude. Because this is actually the only information I care about now for getting the weather. I've already printed out where I am. So now I just need to call this other function that I'll create with a lat and a longe. And so now when I make my request to this one right here, I can take that lat and longe and just use that in my API request, right? So again, dependency. One request is fully complete. I get the data back, and then I do another request, and then now I'm about to get the data back for that, right? Path. Make sure this is good. So something like that. Yep. Oh, this is really tight, actually. So it hurts at about an hour. Hurts at about an hour. Okay. I've added a query string here, so I went to the documentation on this and I kind of looked it up. If I don't put this in here, basically it's going to use imperial units and stuff like that. And so I'm able to configure and say I want Canadian units. That means it's going to be using kilometers per hour and stuff like that. I think that we can see the documentation for that. It's good to kind of here's the units. Return weather conditions in the requested units. So this is kind of cool. Automatically select units based on geographic location. That could be useful. CA is the same as SI, except wind speed and wind gust are in kilometers an hour instead. Yeah, the US does. The default is imperial units. Yeah, I don't know. I'm just gonna stick with Canada, right? But showing you here, we can configure that. So now, console.log the body, and this should be weather information for. Oops. Should be weather information for my location. Okay. I mean, it's looking pretty good. There's like, at least it's not California and stuff, right? So here's, yeah, it's looking like this is the right place. Has references to Vancouver and stuff. I could copy this whole thing, right? Just like I did before. Maybe. No, I don't even know if I'm gonna be able to copy the whole thing out. If it was in the terminal, I would, but I know that my my debug output in VS Code kind of chops off really big chunks of text. But if I were to break this down, it's just gonna look like what they've suggested here is the structure of my data. So always go back to the documentation to kind of see what the structure of the data is, and if they don't provide it, that's a big mistake on their side. But you can always do the request, take it, prettify it, and then kind of see what you get anyways, right? So here I make this request. I'm going to get back the location, the time zone. I'm going to give information back about what it currently is. I can get minutely. Is that even a word? I don't know. Hourly for sure. Daily, that makes more sense to me. Yeah. So daily should be, yeah, the weather for every day for a week, I think. And you're going to notice daily actually gives us a summary. Says, for all of these days, this is the summary. Mixed precipitation through the week with temperatures falling on Saturday. Okay. But then the data is an array of objects where each object represents a day in that week. So I'm going after this right here. This is what I'm interested in, because this is going to give me the data for today or tomorrow, and then the next object is going to be the day after, and the next object is going to be the day after that. So that's what I'm trying to gain access to. The way that I do that is by parsing this object and then saying .daily to get that first piece out of it. Var data equals json.parse body, and we will print out data.daily. Thank you. Parsed, yeah, that one. Any more? Nice. All right. And so here's this thing that it's printing out. I don't like that it's cutting off all that stuff. So what I'll do quickly is just... Oops. That's better. Kind of lets me see everything that's in here. So here is my daily object. And my daily object, I still need to dive a little bit more into it because otherwise it's just the summary of the daily. So I'm going to say daily.data. Okay, if I run this again, it's going to look very similar, except now it's an array of objects, and these are the objects that are actually going to tell me by day what the weather is. So that's what I'm looking for. And if I want to look at today's, that'll give me back just one. If I want to look at tomorrow's, or I can do that as well. And so what I really need to do is loop through the days of the week, right? This is where I'm going to give it a better name. Because data.daily is good, but data.daily.data to me is not very useful. But if I just create a variable called days and then assign that to it, now it tells me what this represents is an array of days. So for days, I'm going to go for each of them, and when I do that, I have to provide a function where it provides back to me that day's object, right? A very simple test might be just to see what the icon is for each day. Does anybody want to take a chance at telling me what the output for this would look like, potentially? Cool. Hopefully, right? Yeah, hopefully. I snowboard, so hopefully rain, 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 rain. But yeah, you're right, exactly. We're going to get kind of an overview of what the next week looks like as with the icon. So we're getting fog, partly cloudy, rain, partly cloudy, rain, rain, partly cloudy. Yeah, but you're right. You're right. I don't know what the weather's going to be, but you were right about the output. And we get 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 of these. So I assume that that's kind of like the next week up until today, including a week today, maybe? I don't know. We could find that out pretty easily. Because we're also going to get a time for that day. So I could just print that out instead. Does that help? So this is a timestamp, right? This is how the weather thing is telling us about this. They're telling us about the time at which this weather is meant to happen. And so we want to convert this into a format that actually makes some sense to us. So I'm going to use a library called moment.js. And one of the cool things about moment is you can format dates. If we have a moment object that represents a certain date and a point in time, we can use this format function and give it a parameter that describes how the formatting should look, and then it will give us back that date using that format. Does it kind of make sense? Okay. So let's look up the documentation for, look up the documentation for format or display. It's under display. This is the table that we use to figure out what possibilities we have for display formatting. So for example, if I wanted to show the full month name, I would use 4 M's to represent that. But if I wanted just to show the number of the month, I would just use the M for that. Okay, so I can describe pretty much any date using a combination of this formatting. I've already included the moment library, so I'm just going to start to use it. One of the things I can do is I can give moment a time, and it will create a date object out of that for me. Okay. Something looks wrong here.
Is that very first moment?
Sorry?
That's like the first moment that it knows about?
Yeah, so this is something that's tricky. So day.time, I'm able to pass moment a timestamp, right? and it will create an object for me based on that. But what I'm noticing is it's creating me objects for days, but these are not the days that I'd expect. I'd expect that to be today and tomorrow and the next day's dates. But I'm actually seeing it's close to what we'll call epoch, right? So it's like January 1st, 1970, 0th hour is the beginning of our timestamp relative number that we're using. Okay? So a timestamp is really, let's say, the number of seconds since this date that we've decided is the beginning of this thing, the epoch, right? And I'm noticing it's giving me the same date, but the time is not the same here. I'm going to go over to my documentation, and I'm going to read a little bit about the time. I don't know exactly where. Here we go. It'll either be a Unix time, that is seconds since GMT, January 1st, 1970, or a string formatted like this. It's as far as I can tell, it's the Unix time right now. That's what they're giving us is the Unix time. Unix time is in seconds. Moment expects it to be in milliseconds. This is where the two APIs are kind of at odds, right? So we have a couple solutions for this. One, I can say, how do I want to do this? There it is. Yep. Thank you. Yes. Awesome. So we can see this is how I was using it, right? I was just calling moment and passing it a number, the number I got from the API. And this is fine as long as it give it to me in milliseconds. I could do that because moment expects milliseconds. I have another option. I could call it like this instead and give it that number. And now it's saying create a moment from a Unix timestamp. So that's the seconds now. So I've got two solutions I could take. Keep the seconds-based time from Dark Sky and use that. So now, much better. 14th, 15th, 16th, 17th, 18th, 19th. So that's one solution. I can do that as well, right? If I need to convert seconds into milliseconds, this is another way to do it. And so it gives me the same result. But something to watch out for, right? Like I had to go, when I was doing this originally, I did the same thing. I was like, what's going on here? Why is it showing me 1970? And because of what I know from my experience, it was a pretty straightforward solution for me. But I went and looked at the documentation, then I fully understood, okay, well, they've decided how they're going to represent times, and I have to fully understand how an API is going to represent its data before I can start using it. I can't just make assumptions that moment uses what this thing returns, okay? So I'll just create a variable called date and assign that there. And what I want to console log out is something more like date.format. And here's where I need to decide what that format is. Go down to display. So we want it to be the full month. So I'm just going to choose month, 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 month. Oops. Now, if I print this out, actually I don't know. Yeah, it's going to work. Just gives me January for everything. Is that a surprise? Okay. So the next thing we want is we want it to be January, or actually no, I think we want the day first, maybe. Maybe we want this first. So let's put the day and then the month. So it'd be like Monday, comma, January. Tuesday, comma, January. So let's see what this looks like now. That's a bit better. Okay. Now, if I want to use first, second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth to represent the day of the month, which option should I use here? It is definitely on this page. Oops, I'll put that back now that I've made it bigger. Sorry. Where is it? Capital D. So capital D will give me this right here, right? So let's try capital D. We're very close. Yeah, do is kind of what we're after, because we want it to do st in the and ista and th, right? Yeah, question.
Why are the parameters for that in quotes? Like,
This one here?
yeah.
I'm providing a string to the format function,
Oh, no,
and then it parses this string and says, oh, you've got d. That means you want a, yeah. Yeah. But so I have to pass a string that represents the format I want this in, where some things are absolutely literal. This is absolutely literal, comma space. That's what I want in that date string. Whereas this means we want that. Now the question is, what would happen if you want it to actually say d? I don't know if we do it that way. I don't know how to if you wanted to actually put dd next to each other, there must be an escape sequence for that. But if I look too much into that, we'll run out of time.
Yeah,
So
okay, I just got mixed up by the string
Yeah.
for a second, then I
Cool.
remember saying that's the string.
yeah, we pass it a string, exactly. So we'll use do, and the cool thing about this is that when you use a library like this, we could set it to be French or English or Spanish or anything like that, and then when we format the dates, it'll use the French versions of this, and it'll use the French month names, and it'll use the French weekday names. That's another really great benefit to using a library like Moment, is that we don't have to do the localization or internationalization ourselves for something like that. So here we'll say day, month, and then the actual numbered day, and so we should get a lot closer to what we were looking for, right? I put in here some new tabs to make sure that all my even though the dates will be different lengths, I want all my temperatures to line up. So by putting in a couple tabs, it's going to force all that content over, and then yeah, pretty straightforward. Okay, so \t, similar to \n, is it represents the tab character. Okay, I could put that in there too if I wanted to. I like to be really explicit about it, because to me I can't tell if that's multiple spaces or a tab just by looking at it. But with this, I'm very clear on what that means. I know what it means. So that's why I would prefer to use that rather than actually pressing the tab button. Totally up to you. It's kind of like when you hit the enter, it puts a new line in for you, or you can just put the new line in and ignore it. All right, so tab, and then what we want to put in is the I think the low temperature, right? So it's called it's going to come from the API. Let's see. I'm going to set a quick breakpoint here, run this, and just take a look at what the day looks like. Oh, there we go. It wasn't running because I had an error still. So I look at the day here. Oh, sometimes it's a little bit easier for me to look at it over here. On the first iteration, I'm looking for the temperature low and temperature high. That's what I want from this. Temperature low, temperature high. And those are on the day object. So I can say and hope that this... Actually, I'll kill that. I'll run it in here. It's a little easier to see. Okay, that looks pretty close to me. It's gonna warm up a little bit. Yeah.
Why do all of the temperatures line up? Like,
Hmm.
wouldn't it just tab the same for each date?
Oh, I see what you're saying. No, the way that tabs work is it's not going to be. So if I go in here and I say first, oops, I can't hit tab there because it'll autocomplete. So these things are a different value, but if I hit tab at the end of either of these, it's actually going to find the next one, right? And so here, if I hit tab, next, and here, if I hit tab, it's only going to the next. Kind of interesting, right? So I gave myself enough tabs to make sure that it would hit the end there. I don't know what else to kind of say. I'd probably give these a few. I'd probably give these. Yeah, very similar to a word processor. And this is all just formatting output, and so your console, it's the same rules. If it comes across a tab, it inserts the tab. Someone decides what a tab, the size of a tab is. It's not me necessarily. Now that's three tabs in here. Oops, I gotta make sure I put it at the end though, otherwise it will. Because my editor converts the tabs to spaces, so this isn't entirely accurate. Whenever I type a tab into my editor here, it actually gives me back 2 spaces as a result. And that just, my preference for coding is that I decide how many spaces there are rather than some editor that describes how big a tab is. Because then if I put my code on GitHub, it does 8 characters for all my tabs. But if I convert my tabs to spaces, it does 2 spaces, and that's the end of the story, right? We're not going to get too much into tabs versus spaces. Okay. Now I've definitely gone quite a bit over here. Let's see if we can wrap this up quickly. I want to put that little degree symbol in here. Best way to do that is degree symbol, and then copy it from a page that has it on it already. Or you can go into like some character encoding map or something if you want, but this might be one of the easier ways to do it. Is I just copy and paste it from the website. All right. S, get rid of that S. Okay, so now we're getting pretty close. It's showing me. There's one thing I want to do here. I just want to show me. I don't care about the point, like the decimal points. I don't care about any of that. So maybe what I want to do is remove that by rounding it. I can just math round it. It's going to give me the closest either side. I don't want to chop it off because maybe it's like 6.8 or 6.9. That's probably closer to 7. So I'll do the rounding on it. There we go. And then here's where I would add in my range. And now I have to say math.round day.temperature high. And then I'll add this little guy as well. Kind of makes sense. Yeah. Last piece that was missing is that icon, right? I want to be able to take that icon, and if it says fog, I want it to show me this right here. So the easiest way to do that is just to concatenate weather and day.icon. Now, let's run it, make sure it works, and then talk about it quickly. Ooh, and we can see I should probably put a tab in there to make sure they all line up as well, right? So, is anyone unclear on how this happened? We're all pretty okay with that? It's just doing a lookup in that object, converting whatever the icon is into a relevant emoji instead. Okay. Let's just make sure. So we covered environment, separating code and config, secrets, did all that. Using gitignore, okay. There's a little bit about dates on there. Other than that, we've covered it. If anyone wants to go a bit farther with this, look at another example. I did create an example that I didn't actually end up putting into the lecture because I felt like I did this first and then I went and did the weather stuff after, and I thought the weather stuff was just a little bit better for right now. But if you are curious, there's another file in here called translate.js, and it uses a lot of the same processes and strategies to interact with the Watson API, which is IBM's supercomputer that does Jeopardy and all that. You can actually, they have an API they've exposed. You can go and make requests, for example, to translate English text into conversational Spanish if you want, right? And the requirement for that is you would have to go create your Watson account, create your and then grab the login and password, and then create those environment variables for that. And then this app would run for you, and it should translate each of these pieces of text into Spanish instead. Lots of things we can do. It looks simpler I felt like the other example was stronger. That's all. Yes. For sure.
So it's secure because HTTP doesn't remember, like once you send it one way, it's just a one-way communication. As long as that like HTTPS is a secure channel, your password and username is
Hmm.
going to be exposed to everybody as it's getting sent.
Yeah, I think what we're talking. So for Victoria, I think what we're talking about here is I could make a request to my GitHub API, right? And I could say. If I go in and I say, actually, I guess I should. So I'll grab this. If I make that request, it says, oh, I've run out of, we've hit that rate limit, right? So in order to solve that problem, I go and I grab my personal access token, and GitHub, oh, this is great. I didn't go over what I said I would. So GitHub has documentation somewhere. Here it is. And authentication. There are a few different ways that we can authenticate with GitHub. One of the ways is through a username and a password. This is if you want to make a curl request with username and password to api.github.com. I don't recommend basic authentication. One, because then you are actually using your password and it becomes a little bit more risky. Chances are people won't see it if you're making these requests, but it then might be in your bash history, for example. All of the commands that I've run in my editor or in my terminal show up in here. So if someone got access to that and I ran a curl command that had my login and password for GitHub, it potentially could see it there. Okay. So I don't like that, although it is an option. I don't use this with GitHub. We've got this other option here, which is set in a header. And with the header, we can set the token. So we just have to follow this format. And as long as this contains my OAuth token or my secret key, that'll work just fine. And this is actually not a bad way to do it. But again, it's going to show up in your... all of these things are going to show up in your history if you're not careful, right? Here's another way to do it. We can send it as a parameter. And this is kind of what I was trying to get to, is that this is actually a realistic way for us to do this in the browser. I go here and I make my request to users Jensen repos, and I say access, and where is it? It's access token equals, and then I put this in there, and I make my request, and I get the information back. If I was on a computer at the library or something, then if someone wanted to see that token that I used, you just go to my history. So this is kind of unfortunate, right? This is actually one of the reasons we might want to put it on the header instead, is because then it doesn't show up in our history. It's on the request. So the question originally was, can people see this? Is HTTPS secure enough for us to put these tokens on the header? I'd say it is. I'd say that when we make this request, if someone had access to this panel here, HTTPS is not going to protect us from that. But HTTPS is going to protect us from someone listening to our network communication and being able to listen to plain text messages being sent across. So what HTTPS is doing is when we make this request, it creates the request, it encrypts it, it sends the encrypted version so no one can see what we actually did. The server receives the encrypted version, decrypts it, does what it needs to, encrypts the response, sends the response back, and then you decrypt the response on that side. So HTTPS is meant to help solve that problem. But if you're making requests like this in the browser and they show up in your history, they're in the history and anyone could find them at that point. It's a little bit different when we're talking about this, though, right? Because here there is no history, really. I mean, there's my bash history. When it's making this request, then we are only concerned about the network traffic and encrypting that, and so HTTP handles that fully, yes. All of this would be, if you were to use a tool like Wireshark, and this is actually a tool you could run on your machine right now, and I mean, I'm not recommending that, but you could download and run this. And what it does, I don't know if they have a. I want to find maybe some images, because it's a tool that looks like this that shows you every single message that's sent back and forth between your machine and others. So if things are sent in plain text through a tool like this, I could go and see the data that's being sent back and forth, including any tokens or anything that was in there. The reason why we keep them in that environment file is mostly to keep them out of GitHub, keep them protected from that. Is there anything else I can think of? The environment is an important thing for us to understand, just because that's kind of where we are in the curriculum today. Making the requests and stuff like that, that's all part of the work, and I'm not doing that to show you how to do it. I'm just showing you what's possible, right? Cool. Okay. Like I said, you'll notice that the code's a little bit different here. If you want, I could copy and paste this garbage. I'll post it here. It's a new snippet. I'll just post a new snippet. I'll say it's JavaScript. I'll paste it in here so I get nice highlighting. Is that all right? Cool. All right. Thanks, everyone. Sorry about the overtime.